Good morning and welcome, guys, to this beautiful day in world history. I've already told a lot of you guys as you've come in that we're going to just tackle the end of World War II today. We're going to get excited to get everything finished up. We're going to talk about our final activity or final assignment that we're going to have tomorrow. But today, we have to finish up some of the content and all the other related things to help us remember, think back, and understand how World War II and why World War II actually comes to an end. I am super proud of you guys for showing up today. It looks like a lot of us are doing super well and showing up and being consistent about coming to class. So I'm happy with that. I really like that effort. And for those of you guys that are going to be watching this recording on YouTube, you're doing an awesome job making sure to follow through and turn that work in. Now, today I posted your agenda on Google Classroom like always. And this is a nice little gentle reminder as we jump in and talk about this today to make sure to go to Classroom, check everything that we're doing each day, and if you somehow get behind, you can go in and you can look at every single day's work, finish that up, get that done, and turn it into me. All right? All of these classes are posted on YouTube. You can always get in, look at the classwork that we have, and try to tackle that on your own to make sure you're ready and good to go. So if you take a look, I'm going to share my screen real quick so that we can take a look at Classroom and you can see what's going on. So on Classroom right now, this is your classwork tab. I'm going to come over here so you can see what I see, or I can see what you see. Okay, right here you've got your agenda. Everyone got to take a quick look at that and understands what's going on. This is where you get your Zoom link. Here's what we're going to tackle today. All right, I've had a lot of questions where kids are saying, well, hey, I don't know exactly where to start. Have I turned everything in? Do I know what's going on? Remember, we got two tips. The first tip is look over here into this upcoming box. That tells you the assignments that are upcoming due, okay, that are coming up. And in my class, it's always on Saturday when things are due. So those are all the things that are due on Saturday. Make sure you have that done, all right? So you can look through here. You can also find everything in classwork, okay? All of the work that we've done for this class, and you can check to see if you've turned it in. You can look right here in this tab. So make sure to stay on top of that. Follow through, get that done. That's just another little gentle reminder to make sure that we are staying responsible and getting everything done the way we need to. All right, so guys, today as we begin to tackle the end of World War II and we set ourselves up to be successful on our final projects, here's what I want to do. I want to kind of give you guys some structure so that you don't have to write everything down as we go through some of the nitty-gritty information in the notes. So I have posted right here. Does someone have a question?
Yeah. When
What's
do
up?
we get to pick our movie?
When you get to pick your movie? I'm going to give you a list tomorrow. When I give you the assignment, I'm going to give you a list of all of the movies that you could pick to watch. Or if you find one that's not on the list, all you have to do is email me, and I can take a look at it and see if I approve it to be your movie that you're going to watch. So it's kind of a free reign as long as it applies to World War II, and I'll have a whole list of things that are available on Netflix and Hulu and for free and a bunch of different stuff. Okay, because you can find some stuff on YouTube and other things. So make sure to be thinking about that. But that's a really good question. I'll give you all that information tomorrow. So getting back to where we were talking about here, guys, if you take a look on your classwork tab right here or even in the stream, I posted an assignment for you. If you click on that, okay, all you have to do is it looks like this. You click right here, the End of World War II guided notes. Open that up. You should have a personal copy of that when you open it. And there are some blanks in there that you're going to type in and fill out as we take notes for this class. So here's what I want to do. I want to double check to make sure everyone's following along. So once you have that opened up and you are ready to go, I want you to go over to your participants tab and I want you to click the green little check mark yes, saying, hey, I'm ready to go. I've got my guided notes open and we're going to tackle this whole thing so that we can get done with World War II in a timely fashion. So make sure that once you have it done and you're ready to go, it's open to type, click yes.
I think Tristan lost the check mark. He can't find it.
Tristan, can you find the check mark? All right, it looks like a lot of us are finding it here. I want to see a few more people here. Mr. Gatto's got it for sure. All right, guys, make sure you're prepped and open. That check mark tells me you're paying attention, you're participating. I want to make sure that we are showing up and getting the most out of this. Oh, perfect. It looks like a lot of us are getting this. Sweet. All right, I'm happy with that. If you're still working kind of behind, make sure to get that open and get ready to go as we kind of jump into our notes. We're going to go pretty quick today because the crazy thing about this, guys, is that you learn about World War II a ton. You've heard it in American history. You've heard all of these different things. You've heard about the D-Day invasion. Like, you have that background knowledge. So we're just going to kind of give you a refresher. We're going to tap into that prior knowledge, and we're going to talk about a few different things that you might not have heard of before, and that's how we're going to close out some of the stuff when it comes to World War II. Now, this tab thing is going to be a pain. Let's see if we can find, here's what we'll do. There we go. Okay, so we are going to talk about the end of World War II. I've got to bring this thing up. Our little tab is getting in the way here. All right, perfect. So guys, here are our notes on the end of World War II. We're going to cruise right through this, make sure we're good to go. And as long as you follow along in your guided notes, everything should be word for word. You should be able to find the blanks, type in those blanks, and be ready to go. All right? So the end of World War II, that's the title of these notes. This is going to lead to what we know as the Allied victory in World War II. The United States, Great Britain, the Soviets, France, technically, all of the Commonwealth countries of Great Britain, they end up being victorious at the end of World War II. We all know that, right? The United States won. The United States and its allies won. But how do we get there? That's what we're exploring today, so that we know the when, the where, and the why when it comes to this victory. So the end of World War II is an interesting time period because it's kind of spread out all throughout an entire year. So World War II ends in 1945, all right? Now, I'm not sure if you can see me in my little box, okay? You might be able to see me, but over here, I'm going to write on the board just so that you remember, World War II, it ends in 1945. And the crazy thing about that is that it might end in 1945, but all of the surrenders and the end of the actual conflict is spread out over that entire year. That's what's kind of crazy about this. So Germany ends up surrendering much earlier, actually, all the way like early into, some people would say it was fall, but it was mostly the end of summer, and Japan doesn't surrender until almost into the end of the month in November. So there's kind of this crazy time period where over the span of an entire year, we see the war start to wind down and come to an end. And that's where we're going to try to focus a lot of our efforts today to understand the end of World War II. All right, so that's why we're talking about this in our notes. So thinking back, guys, these are the things that we've talked about so far. This is the background knowledge that we know that we have. And I want to make sure we tap into that so that we can be thinking about some of these things and how they relate to the content we cover today. So if we think back, we talked about Hitler dominating Europe early. That was one thing that we made sure to reinforce. Hitler had dominated Europe. He was smashing them in the mouth basically the entire time, all the way up from the beginning of World War II to 1942. All right? We talked about how Hitler betrayed the Soviets and invaded them. We talked about the attack on Pearl Harbor and the war in the Pacific. We talked about how many theaters World War II was fought in. If someone can, unmute your mic and someone remind me, how many theaters was World War II fought in? What do we got? I heard a little mumble. How many theaters? It was 2. Guys, World War II was fought in 2 theaters. Be thinking back to that because we talked about how World War II is not only fought in Europe, but it's fought in the Pacific. All right? We call those theaters of war. All right? So it's fought in 2 theaters. And then finally, guys, what we really accomplished last week was we talked about the Holocaust and the atrocities that the Nazis committed during the Holocaust itself. Now, if you saw on our agenda, guys, our learning target for today is to understand when and why World War II came to an end. And all of these things are going to trickle down and going to help inform us to achieve that and make sure we understand when and why World War II came to an end. So, turning the tide. This is our first little section that we talk about. So, where we left off in 1942, guys, if you actually think about this, where we left off in 1942, things were not looking good for the Allies. Remember, we talked about how not only Hitler had Europe almost under his complete control and he was bombing Great Britain, but Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. They were dominating the Pacific like crazy. They had control of almost all those islands. Remember, they had like 1 million square miles of Pacific islands under their control. And the United States was still trying to rebuild and really get going after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Great Britain, at the same time, was on the edge of surrender. Guys, things were not looking good for the Allies in 1942. But that's when we really see things start to turn around. The United States jumps into the war in late 1941. We start seeing these changes, and that's why we call this turning the tide. Because after the United States kind of rebuilds and gets ready to go, the Allies start mounting an attack against the Axis powers. And the first way that they do this is they decide to attack German troops in Africa first. So while the United States is a little bit involved in the Pacific and they're over there kind of working with their naval fleet in that theater of war, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the military commander that was in charge of all of the United States military forces, actually decides to go in and attack the Germans that have gone into northern Africa and started occupying that area, getting ready to really start to control Europe as much as possible. And so the Allies decide to attack the German troops in Africa. They win. They push the German troops out of Africa back into Europe. And then at the same time, on the other side of Germany, the Germans are starting to suffer some major defeats in Russia. Remember, the Germans had attacked Russia. Remember, guys, Germany sits in Europe right in the middle. It's this country that sits in the middle. On one side, you have France. On the other side, you have Russia. And just like in World War I, Germany ends up fighting, a war on two fronts, where Russia is an enemy and France, Great Britain, and the U.S., which attack here from the west, all right, they are enemies of Germany. And so it ends up being this like German sandwich where two enemies really squeeze in and start attacking them. And because of that, the Germans start to suffer a little bit. They start suffering defeats in Russia. They start getting pushed out of Africa. One of the most notable battles that happens in Russia is the Battle of Stalingrad. The city of Stalingrad was named after Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviets at the time. And the people that lived within that city have been given specific instructions to defend it and fight to their own death. And the Germans also refused to give up their attack on that city. They ended up sieging Stalingrad. They bombed it every single night until the entire city was wiped out. There wasn't a single solid building over 2 stories tall that was standing within that city after the battle was over. But it lasted forever. This city was under siege. Eventually, because the Germans did not give up, the Soviets had a counterattack, and they end up actually capturing 90,000 German soldiers. And they win the Battle of Stalingrad, which was a huge move for the Russians. And it really knocks Hitler and the Nazis down a peg, and it starts making them question whether or not they're as powerful as they think they are. So overall, the tide starts to turn. In 1942, as we get to the end of 1942, the tide starts to flip. The Allies start to win. They start picking up little victories and big victories along the way. Now, after the Allies invaded Africa, guys, instead of going in and trying to liberate France, which was an Allied power, instead of going in and trying to take all of Europe, the Allies decided, Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, who ended up being basically the commander of all of the United States military forces, they decide that they want to actually attack Italy, and they want to invade Europe from the south. So after winning in Africa, the Allies decide to attack and invade Italy. And it actually goes really, really well for them. So you can see in this map down here, after the Allies win, this is the northern tip of Africa up here. After the Allies win, they actually send in a full assault into the country of Italy. And they end up dominating almost the entire Italian peninsula. And this leads to the topple of the rule of dictator Benito Mussolini. Remember we talked about how this bald-headed dude, Mussolini, was the leader of Italy. He was a fascist. He aligned himself with Hitler. Italy was an Axis power at the time. They weren't incredibly strong, but they were there and they were active. And the United States stepped in, and so did Great Britain, and they attack from the south and they take over Italy. So this is the beginning of the tide starting to turn, right? So we have victories in Africa. We have victories in Southern Europe and Italy. And so things start to change. Hitler and the Nazis and the Axis powers start to lose their upper hand. So make sure we're following along, guys. In our guided notes, the next thing I want to really talk about super quick is what happens on the home front. So, guys, the home front, when we talk about a war, is what's going on at home, what's going on in the home countries. And when it comes to the Allies, the home front was a very interesting idea, and it played itself out in an interesting way. So during World War II, all of the Allied countries had to make sacrifices to wage total war. When I say total war, guys, what I mean is an entire country, an entire national economy is directed at the war effort. See how I put that right here in this first bullet point? An entire national economy is directed at the war effort. That's a huge piece to understand total war. Guys, when we start talking about maybe the wars that the United States has in the Middle East right now, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of the conflicts that we go through, a lot of people might classify that as war, but you have to understand that that's not total war. During World War II, the Allied countries, the Soviets, Great Britain, France at a time, and the United States had to direct every single thing that their country did to devote themselves to winning World War II. And so that meant factories that normally produce things like cars, okay, they were converted to make military and wartime goods. So they were making guns and bombs and boots and extra tires for Jeeps and literally things that just the war needed. And we see this very, very obvious change where an entire country decides to devote itself to supplying goods for the war effort. And not only that, but guys, there's tons and tons of propaganda to help bolster this up and get support from the people that live on the home front. See, that's this bullet point that I have right here. Now, this is where we see like advertisements. Remember, we looked at propaganda in World War I, so I didn't want to beat it to death. But we understand that it's a media or a form of media that has an underlying message. It's trying to communicate something to you. And so during World War II, you saw propaganda all over the United States about growing victory gardens. So making sure not to take any of the food maybe or the foodstuffs, the food supply away from the United States military. You were supposed to grow your own garden to try to feed as much as you could the own people in your household. There were also tons and tons of propaganda things about like having penny drives to raise money for the war effort, buy war bonds. A ton more pieces. There were a ton more examples of propaganda when it came to like conserving gas in tires. So they had actual laws passed that said that you couldn't go in the United States over the speed limit of 45 miles an hour in order to save money on tires and not like wear out the rubber on your tires quickly, and to get the best fuel economy so that you weren't buying gas all the time and they could save as much as they could for the war effort. So this is what total war was, and this is what life looked like on the home front. It's much different than the life that we know today, and it's everything directed at winning the war. So that's what's going on behind the scenes. And this is what's leading to this tide that's starting to turn as we get to the end of World War II. Now, all of these things end up leading to, ultimately, and we know this isn't a spoiler, there's no spoiler alerts here, we understand that the Allies have a victory, and the first victory that they have is in Europe. So by the summer of 1944, the Allies were actually starting to gain the upper hand. They had not only invaded through Italy, but they had controlled a lot of Africa. The United States is starting to do some good things in the Pacific on the other theater of World War II. And this is when they decided to invade Europe through France and take the German armies head on. So what happens is the Allied forces get together, they pull all of their resources into one spot in Great Britain, and they decide they're going to invade across the English Channel onto the beaches of Normandy, France, to actually get onto mainland Europe and start beating the Germans back from France, basically, from the borders of France all the way, and they're going to try to work their way back to Germany. So we call this Operation D-Day, right? This was the D-Day invasion. You've heard of this. You've seen this. This is probably one of the most notable events of World War II. People always remember D-Day because it's this kind of crazy, bold move that ends up really turning the tide and shifting the focus of World War II. So the operation was bloody. Guys, it was this land assault in which all of the different allies, so there were Commonwealth troops, so there were troops from Canada and Australia and India and Great Britain and the United States, and they all came together and invaded the beaches of Normandy. Now, we could get into the nitty-gritty of the invasion of D-Day, but quite honestly, we just don't have the time, and you guys have heard a lot of this background. But what you should know is that the D-Day invasion was ultimately successful, but it was incredibly bloody. 2,700 or 2,700 American men were lost on those beaches in Normandy alone. That's not counting British soldiers, Commonwealth soldiers, French soldiers, anyone else that was fighting. Those were just Americans. But one thing that's notable is that after the successes of D-Day, the Allies actually ended up starting to advance steadily. Once the Germans gave in on those beaches of Normandy, the Allies were able to continuously send troops into Europe to fight and beat back the German army's line. So remember that not only did Germany have to fight the Allies as they were invading on Normandy, but Germany is part of that German sandwich right here in Europe, in which they've got France on one side and Russia on the other. So Germany is constantly having to fight on two fronts. Remember, I put that right there to make sure to point that out. So Germany is constantly having to fight on two fronts, the Soviets from the east and the British/Americans from the west. And so Germany is being squeezed. The Allies are starting to come in from France and really starting to dominate. They end up winning this incredibly huge battle called the Battle of the Bulge. And eventually, the Allies cross the Rhine River into Germany, which marks the border between France and Germany. They cross into Germany, and there's really nothing that the Germans can do. Eventually, by the end of World War II, guys, when the Germans surrender, the Soviets have squeezed in on Germany so much, as well as the Allies have squeezed in on Germany from the west so much, that they have surrounded the capital city of Berlin, and they just start pounding the city with artillery and starting to bomb it out. Now, that is when Germany really decides that there's nothing that they can do. In fact, Hitler, at this time, marries his longtime companion, basically his girlfriend. Her name was Eva Braun. He marries her, and then the next day, he and her committed suicide. So on April 30th, Hitler and his wife end up committing suicide, and then only 7 days later, all of Germany falls under an unconditional surrender, which means that they surrender unconditionally. They give up to the will of the Allies. So on May 7th, 1945, the Germans finally surrender, and the Allies have a victory in Europe. And that's a pretty big thing. Now, one thing that I wanted to show you, and I'm going to see if I can modify this really quick. But I wanted to show you a quick little scene from one movie that you're going to have an option to watch. Now, one thing I'll preface this with is that this is a pretty nitty-gritty war movie. This is called Saving Private Ryan. Now, this is going to be an option for you to watch, but one of the biggest things that I'm going to say about this whole movie assignment is you should not watch something that you do not have express parent permission to watch. All right? It must be appropriate, deemed from your parents. So I'm not telling you to go out and watch rated R movies. In fact, I would say that most of you, if you do not have kind of that background and understanding, I would suggest that you don't. However, if you do have express permission from your parents, you can do this. But I want to make sure that you see this and you understand kind of the severity of the D-Day invasion, because this is kind of crazy. Now, one thing I do want to do is I'm going to switch this up really quick so that you can see the audio here and watch a little bit. So this is like a 20-minute clip. I'm going to fast forward through it so you can see some of the parts. But this is a scene from Saving Private Ryan. So these are... invasion. One thing that made it specifically like really, really horrendous and horrible to invade on this beach is that the Germans had dug into their positions. Notice they have these, they're called like tank ballards here, which prevent big armored vehicles from coming up onto the beach. Not only did they have that, but they had a ton of artillery bunkers and machine gun bunkers lining this beach. And one thing that was unique about the beach at Normandy is that it was like an ocean beach, and then it kind of came up on a cliff that you had to kind of climb. And so you had all of these German armaments in these bunkers built up on that cliff, and they're just shooting down, able to... So guys, see, if you look, they're advancing towards this beachhead where there's this sheer cliff that they're going to end up having to climb to go up and take out these German armaments. Now, I think that gives us a really good understanding of kind of the severity of this whole thing. But something I want to reiterate and I want to let you guys know and have you guys understand is that this D-Day invasion that happened was incredibly bloody, and it was only won by really the willpower of the Allied forces working hard and working together to make sure that they were able to overrun these German defenses and actually establish a forward operating point in Europe. So one last thing that we have to talk about is, if you remember, guys, someone remind me, unmute your mic and tell me, how many theaters was World War II fought in?
2.
It was 2. There we go. Finally, we got it. I like that. All right. So it was 2 theaters. Right now, we've talked about the victory in Europe, but there's still one more theater to go. All right. And that is in the Pacific. Guys, the U.S. is battling the Japanese after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in the Pacific. All right. Now, eventually, the United States wins, but the Japanese don't surrender right away. In fact, they don't even surrender really close to the time that the Germans surrender. So the Germans actually surrender in the beginning of May, remember May 7th. The Japanese don't end up actually surrendering until September 1945. So after the Germans surrender, there was still one more theater of war that had to work itself out. And the United States had to fight long and hard in the Pacific to make this victory happen. The Japanese really refused to surrender. They had a really strong foothold in the Pacific Island nations, and they fought incredibly hard. So this is where you hear of battles like Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. All of these different battles are part of this island hopping campaign that the United States had to go on to take out these different spots. so that they could win and advance on Japan to force a surrender. Now, as the United States military hopped from island to island, getting closer to Japan, there was still a huge amount of casualties because the Japanese fought incredibly hard. They not only dug into each of their positions, but they had kamikaze pilots. And you've probably heard of kamikaze pilots before. But guys, kamikaze pilots were Japanese aircraft pilots that would take their fighters, their Japanese Air Force fighters, filled with bombs, and they would actually run them into the side of American cruisers and American naval ships to sink them, sacrificing themselves, committing suicide in order to take out Navy or American Navy military ships. So this was an incredibly tough, taxing, and deadly time period for not only United States forces, but also Japanese forces. Now, the last stop for the United States as they moved on this island hopping campaign was Japan. Now, the Japanese were putting up, like I said, an incredibly tough fight. And so, in order to exact the surrender of Japan, because based on a lot of information, the United States believed that the Japanese wouldn't surrender even if the United States was knocking on their door ready for a land invasion. They didn't want to go through another land invasion like D-Day and suffer a ton of casualties because Japanese was way more, or because Japan and the Japanese fought way harder and were way more densely populated in an area. They couldn't take that land invasion. And so President Harry Truman at the time decided that to make Japan surrender, he was going to drop the United States' secret weapon that they had developed during World War II, during this thing called the Manhattan Project. And it was the atomic bomb. So the United States actually decides, they give the Japanese a warning message. They say, if you don't surrender, you will see fury rain from the sky. The Japanese refused to answer, or they did not answer. And so President Harry Truman actually ends up dropping in August 2 atomic bombs. One atomic bomb he drops on Hiroshima, a Japanese town. The second atomic bomb he drops on Nagasaki. Both towns are almost completely obliterated. Altogether, it probably kills instantly about 200,000 people with the combined instant impact of the blasts of these two atomic bombs. And finally, after their mainland cities were hit so hard and devastated so much, not only by this blasted impact, but also by the radiation fallout from these atomic bombs, the Japanese ended up surrendering in 1945 on September 2nd. And this surrender actually happens aboard the USS Missouri, which is a naval ship. The Japanese emperor actually boards the ship and signs a peace treaty with General Douglas MacArthur, who is the commander of the Pacific Fleet, the United States Pacific Fleet. And the U.S. registers a victory in the Pacific after a use of the very first, or after the very first use of the atomic bomb ever during wartime. So guys, that brings us to the end. I know we covered a lot of information, but that brings us to exactly what we need to know and the different ideas that we have about the end of World War II. Now, if you take a look on Classroom, you followed through, you had this assignment, you went through and you filled out all the different missing pieces in your guided notes. Okay, it was pretty lax, pretty easy. We kind of learned as I talked through this, you got this information, and you're gonna have this background in these themes as we prep and get ready for tomorrow. At 11 a.m., we're gonna meet again, and we're gonna talk about our final World War II movie project that you're gonna work on and you're gonna turn in to really demonstrate connecting some themes that we learned about World War II to a movie that you get to choose to watch. So make sure to stay on top of that and be thinking about that. Follow through, guys. Make sure you have all these assignments in classwork finished up. And if you have those done and you're ready to go, don't forget to turn in that guided note assignment that we were just looking at. Don't forget to turn it in because it's done and I want to give you a grade for it, all right? Don't forget to turn that in, and we'll meet again tomorrow at 11 a.m. It was awesome to see you. Stick around if you have any questions, but if not, you're good to go.
Bye.
Make sure you get your work
Thank
done.
you, Mr. Boyd.
Bye, guys. Thanks for showing up. It was good to see you.
Mr. Boyd,
What's up?
how you been, fella?
I've been good, Angel. How are you doing, bud?
Good.
Yeah, are you staying sane there? Staying at home?
No, not at all.
No. Do you have the